I'm not sure that Professor Wisse will bring to bear the insights she can from Jewish literature in our discussion today, but I've learned an immense amount from reading her on Jewish authors of many generations in many countries and many languages, and certainly many of the things that she has discussed in her scholarly work pertain directly to our subject today. Professor Halbertal, who has been teaching at the Hebrew University for as long as I can remember, has also written abundantly on medieval and modern Jewish thinkers, in addition to his extensive work in connection with Israel's military code of ethics, which will probably enter directly into our subject today. Our plan is not a very carefully formulated one. We're not staging a debate here. We will not be allotting time in equal allotments to each of our participants. We want to discuss these matters, but we do want to consider the question of Jews and power, at least initially, and primarily from the vantage point of the excellent book that Ruth Wisse wrote some 8 years ago on this subject. With the faith of our ancestors and their own conviction that the ways in which they exercised power were inextricably bound up with their faith. And that's something that Ruth illustrates pretty clearly at the very beginning of this book, where she describes the shared mentality of Jews in the pre-modern era and describes them as people who knew that God would be the guarantor of Jewish power as long as Jews obeyed his laws. If they didn't assimilate in the aftermath of the destruction of their kingdom in antiquity, it was because they were sustained by the belief that God had not abandoned them and God still had expectations from them. The prophets taught, in her words, that the political fate of the Jews depended on their ability to convince not their rivals of their military prowess, but God of their uprightness. And then she notes that by situating their politics within a transcendent scheme of judgment, they did not have to accept the verdict of the battlefield. Their defeat at the hands of their enemies wasn't final. Finally, one last sentence from her. The behavior of the entire people, their everyday habits, would determine the severity of collective punishment or the possibility of collective reward. They believed that through repentance they could look forward to divine intervention that would bring their exile to an end. And my question to Ruth on the basis of these observations is, were they deluding themselves? Were they trapped in illusions that oddly enough, and ironically enough, were essential to their survival?
Well, Allan telegraphed me this idea that he very kindly told me that he was going to ask about that aspect of my opening argument here. The word illusion would never have occurred to me in this context. Because my starting point was entirely different. My starting point is the reality of Jewish politics. I start from the very concrete present because my field of Jewish studies is not Jewish political philosophy, and it's certainly not the history of Jewish thought. That's not how I come to these problems. I come to these problems primarily through modern Jewish literature, and modern Jewish literature is the actuality of how the Jewish tradition worked itself out in the everyday. So what I've always been dealing with is the way in which real Jews, the Jewish people really, has seen how this idea of theirs worked out. But I would never have used the word illusion because nothing was more real, and nothing has been more real than the contractual arrangement that Jews entered into with the Almighty, with the Lord of hosts. And what seemed to me, most elementary about that is that, for one thing, it was simply not, it was illusory to talk about Jews as having been a powerless people. That was the illusion of moderns who started to talk about Jews as a powerless people. Do you think that the Jewish people could have gone through history, parents raising their children, teachers training students, saying, hey, we're a powerless people, we're going to go through history as a powerless people? It couldn't have happened. What could have sustained a people? I mean, it's an insane idea that one would have gone through thinking of that. So my question really is, really, of course, Jews understood that as the source of their power. And it was very real to them. And I think in some sense, it's translated itself as being very real. We can come to that in our discussion. So what did that reality mean? Well, for one thing, it became a source of power to them, because if you look at the destruction of the first temple, and this is, after all, the period that we're in now, the period, I'm not talking about the war in Israel, but I'm talking about the period before Tisha B'Av. Jews are in mourning for the destruction of the first temple. And the destruction of the first temple was followed by an astonishing phenomenon. The Jews were driven out of, I mean, it was a tremendous humiliation, tremendous. I can read almost anything about the Holocaust. I cannot bring myself to reread the Book of Lamentations. It's simply too much for me. Much stronger than anything, you know, you tell me Elie Wiesel's Night and the most horrible thing. I mean, it's horrific, horrific, horrific. Nothing held back from that description, right? So the Jews really suffered a fantastic defeat, all of which they registered, all of which they recorded. And they were sent into exile. And then what is the response? The response is, the 137th Psalm, that fantastic thing where if you are a Bob Marley fan, you would say, by the rivers of Babylon, right? And in the summer camps that we used to attend, we would say, Shiru lanu mishiret Zion. This is the boys would sing, and then the girls would say, Ech nashir. You know, how are we going to sing on foreign soil? The pathos of these slaves who were being mocked. And they say, we cannot sing the songs of Zion here. Oh, part one. Part two, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. In other words, let my physical power diminish. That's part two. We all know that part, right? The most famous lines after perhaps the Shema, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem. But the part that we were never taught, and as far as I know, has not been sung to music, right? Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they cried, strip her to her very foundations. Fair Babylon, you predator, a blessing on him who repays you in kind what you have inflicted on us. A blessing on him who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks. Terrifying also in its determination, because what does that third part describe? It really describes the way in which you will regain this country in some way. But the fascinating thing about it is that it doesn't say this is what we will do. It says, remember, O Lord. And it says that someone, a blessing on whoever. So this is quite amazing. So here are the Jews in this terrifying situation, and I would say having suffered a humiliating defeat, who experienced their defeat, how? As I read it, they experienced their defeat in the way that you have described. Yes, Babylon can defeat them militarily, and that's the interesting thing about politics in the world. Everybody thinks of war. I think I'm right in this, right? But there may be, experts in warfare who know better. I think everyone thinks of war in terms of a binary relationship, a clash of powers, France against Germany, Poland against Russia, Sparta against Athens. These are This is the way warfare is. And there's a winner and there's a loser. There's a conqueror and there's a conquered. I don't think that this is the way the Jews experienced it. Because had they experienced it, they would have been defeated. But you see, they did not experience it as an ultimate defeat. They experienced it as a defeat, and then come the prophets, and the prophets say, you are being punished for the fact that you did not win God's protection. Now, to bring this just to, to what I think the crux of it is, in one sense, this says the Jews are indestructible at the hands of any other people. If you really believe this, that you have entered into a covenant with the power of powers, with the Almighty, and what your function in history is to satisfy that ultimate power, and as long as you can do that, no power can ever destroy you, because God is your guarantor of power, then it makes you indestructible. The reason I wrote my book, though, is not because of that. My book leads to the end of the book, which is the real problem with it. As far as the other nations are concerned, as far as the consequences of that idea of power are concerned, you become ultimately the no-fail target, right? Because you do not see warfare as defeating the other person. And the Jews have, we know from the Bible, the Jews could be great warriors, they could fight and all the rest of it. But we also know that the Jewish idea is self-conquest. This is our idea, self-accountability, to make ourselves worthy, and to want that parcel of land which God, promised as the reward for, and as the responsibility for living the way of life that was determined. But if you do not fight in kind, then it becomes always profitable to destroy you, and there's never any political cost to be paid for having destroyed you, for having expropriated you, for having expelled you, for having done anything to you. So just to say that my starting point was not what is the beginning of this book. My starting point is our starting point today. My starting point was B'chol dor vador, Omdim aleinu l'chaloseinu, as my late father would say. In every generation, they are to destroy us, and God rescues us from their hand. And I wanted to understand this, not theologically, but politically.
Well,
what does this mean?
I understand that you didn't want to understand it theologically, but I feel impelled to open up that line of questioning, in part because I was struck by the absence of polemics in that part of the book. This is very much a Zionist book, and it reviews history from a Zionist vantage point. What's notably absent in the beginning is what one often finds in Zionist tracts, and that was any denunciation of the galut mentality. You portray it, you depict it sympathetically, and as you did in your remarks just now, you indicate what kind of power it could supply to the people who retained a faith in God's ultimate intervention in history. But that is a separate question from whether their conception of the world was true. And it's certainly conceivable that an illusion of God's support for them in God's ultimate deliverance could have a sustaining power as well. And I'm wondering whether Moshe wants to comment on that.
So I'm actually sympathetic to the way Ruth describes it as far as your description of medieval Jewish condition, right? The sustaining force of hope. And the sustaining force of hope in the sense of religiously defined as a bond with the divine promise. Where I think actually there is an element of critique, which I share with the kind of Zionist impulse, is not retroactively of all of Jewish history, but at the moment where there was a viable possibility of Jews to self-determine themselves, sort of from the end of the 19th century, And the way then Zionism, this is an old battle that in some ways was won already, but the way in which the Zionist movement had to face a challenge with that mentality, that's where the friction comes. It's really not about a total vision of Jewish history per se. So if you ask me, there are two issues here at stake, I think, in the assumption of Jewish power through the Zionist idea. One is to break with a picture that's very deep, a picture of time, that we either are in exile or in redemption. It's not easy to break with it. By the way, it's not easy to break with it even as we talk. And I think that if you ask me, the essence of Zionism was to assume power so you can determine your own political fate. Redeem yourself from cherpat galut, and galut is cherpa, is a shame. And for that you needed to break, and you needed to break a paradigm, two paradigms. One is that we are either in exile or in redemption. And Zionism wanted to be in a space which is neither exile nor redemption. And against the religious instincts, try to establish a space which is not clear, by the way, that it overcame that binary. Because you have still among Jews in Israel people who think we are still in galut. This is the ultra-Orthodox to a certain degree. And then you have people who say, no, this is redemption. And I think a normal, powerful state cannot take either of them because one is passive and the other one is hyperactive. And the question is whether Zionism will survive its religious past in a complex way, because it tried to break a very deep perception of Jewish history. The other binary condition is one statement that Rav Shach said once. He said, if I had to make a choice between being murdered, מהנרצחים or מהרוצחים, I prefer to be from the nirtzachim. I prefer to be murdered rather than a murderer. Now, Zionism is an attempt to break with it. You can be neither a murderer or not murder. There is a way of using force and assuming force to protect yourself that doesn't force you in either of those two situations. So I think, I would say the following. The modern assumption of power by Jews, as it took form in the Zionist revolution, is in serious struggle or friction with a particular binary thinking that was nourished in the Jewish past, and it had to break with. And that's an ongoing, by the way, this is an ongoing struggle. And it had to break with these patterns. This what I would say about this.
And I think Ruth has something she wants to say
Sure.
in response to that.
Sure.
Well, it's moving into, firstly, this is not the way I experienced Zionism, and it's perhaps why my thinking is very different. I was never brought up as the either-or. And the tradition from which I come does not see Jewish life and Jewish power that way. I know it can be, I know that there was this element within Zionism, believe me, and I understand the struggle today and all the rest of it. But you see, if you are thinking this through theologically, one has to think in terms of the reality of God and all that. I'm just thinking of it through in terms of the actuality of how the Jewish political reality was shaped and developed through the centuries, and particularly in the modern period. How did it happen? And it seems to me that what I see is an extraordinarily creative political experiment in history that was launched. No, that was launched a long time ago, and that could only be launched because of this idea of power. So let me try to
Because of the
explain
idea
that.
of power drawn from this sort of old Jewish past?
Well, consider what I mean by Jewish political
Sure,
experiment. So you have the destruction of the Second Temple, right? And once again, the Jews are thrown into exile, and they have the example of the return to Zion. That was why that was so true, that one would always be returned to the land of Israel, because it had happened once before, and so it was just a question of time that you would be returned to the land of Israel. But then look at what the Jews do. They launch what I call, using political theory and political thinking among Jews and non-Jewish political thinkers, thought that the Jews had disappeared from political history. Right. They thought that the Jews had disappeared from political history because they thought of politics in terms of a state and in terms of its institutions. But if you look at what Jews did, is they remained a people. They remained a people, but they remained a people on their own terms. And so they reconfigured.
Sure.
They reconfigured politics in the following way.
Right.
One, did you need a central political authority, a king, a ruler of any kind? Almost every other people would say you need a central political authority. Jews, because of the way they were constituted and because of the way the Jewish way of life had developed out of the shaping ideas of the rabbinate and all else, Jews could live with a decentralized political reality. Right. And so they went out, they had always a people. The redemption of captives, you know what that required among different communities that didn't know one another. Jews remained a people. It was not a galut. I know what the terms that are used in modern thinking, but you have to think of it as a kind of a people that could live with a decentralized political authority. This is one aspect. Just a second. Then the second aspect, you think the Jews lived without land, which was also central to every polity that one can think of, ultimately land. Jews did not live, in my book, there was one thing that I would rewrite. I say Jews lived without central political authority. I'd stick with that. Jews lived without land. I was wrong to write that. Because even to say it that way, I realized was wrong. They were never without a land. The idea was that they had a land, they just weren't in the land. But you know how important the landscape of Israel is to Jews throughout the ages. You live according to the Jewish calendar. You obey the laws of Shemitah, even in some symbolic way when you're not in the land of Israel. You study those laws that have no relevance to being in Montreal or in Sarajevo or wherever you are. So this is the second thing. You live without central political authority, but with decentralized political authority. You live without being in the land, but with this land you know is yours. And the main thing that comes more and more important is you live without independent means of self-defense. Now, this is huge. And the only reason Jews could live without independent means of self-defense, several reasons, but basically one is because they made themselves invaluable, or they made themselves important to every place that they settled. That was the condition of Jewish settlement wherever they went. You had to prove that you were good enough to be protected by the ruler, because somebody had to protect you. So you had to prove your utility. You had to accommodate. You had to become, in one place you would become traders and do this. In another place you would go into oil. In another place you would be soldiers. In Elephantine, which I know very little about, Jews actually served as soldiers for another entity. You would make yourself useful. So you developed the art of adaptation, of self-adaptation. This is a political experiment which is extraordinary because it worked through an incredible range of societies, and it covered an astonishing range of possibilities. And Jews could not have done it if they did not feel that there was an ultimate protector and an ultimate guarantor of their power, even greater than the king. And you, I mean, you know better than I all the discussions of Dina, the Malchuta Dina, what is owing to the ruler as opposed to what you cannot really accommodate. There were many, many such discussions. So it was always a question of holding, knowing that your role in history was of ultimate importance. And if I may jump ahead, something that is not in the book. You know, it's so interesting that we should come back to a discussion of God, because modern Yiddish literature is usually thought of as being secular. And it's true that it comes into being in the secular period, like modern Hebrew literature. Well, if you look at Yiddish writing after the Shoah, after what Yiddish calls the Churban, which is the same word that it uses for the first Churban, the second Churban. This is yet another Churban. You find a poet like Jacob Gladstein, who is not a religious person. I don't think he attended shul, as far as I know, only when it was like somebody's occasion or something. He begins to write modern liturgy. And what he writes is, God, you live in every Jewish head. And if our heads are destroyed, you, Jewish God, will be missing from the world. So you see the degree to which this language and these convictions remain within what one would call a secular context, because Gladstein, after the Shoah particularly, was living within this context. What was great enough to encompass the enormity of the destruction of the Jewish people? It was that it happened under the aegis of God. And so even when you take that antagonistic stance and you say, we are no longer the guarantors of your power, see, it's still the same conversation where the modern poet says, we will no longer guarantee your presence in the world because of what is done. So the main thing here is this astonishing, as I say, this astonishing ability to forge a political reality that no one else recognized as a political reality because it was so aberrant in terms of how other people see politics. And you see, the reason that it's so important to use the political language for this kind of thing is because the thing is that it's not always recognized that Jewish political behavior is political on the one hand, but unique on the other hand. Right. It is different from the political behavior of other peoples. And this is what happens in the modern period if we get to this.
What we're going to get, actually,
Sorry.
Do you want to say something, Moshe?
No, there are many things I absolutely agree with. And I didn't say that Jews were outside of politics till the emergence of Jewish nationalism. That there was a lot of political savviness, resilient in different ways in which society was structured, etc., etc., all along the period, all along the Galut, by making themselves necessary, etc. We're talking about a particular issue, which is politics via the use of organized power. The last time the Jews did it was in Mered Bar Kokhba, 132. Which was a trauma. From then onwards, there was no use of organized power for self-defense and self-determination. And when we talk about Jews and power, not Jews and politics, Jews as a particular, and the way in which Zionism was a deep transformation of that, theologically it all revolved against those three oaths. Now it looks very archaic, but it was so important, right? The three oaths that God ishbia, that God made Jews to commit to, shelo imredu ba'omot, shelo ya'alu b'choma, etc. So So that's where we have to, I mean, when we talk about power, we have to refine it not as politics at large, right? And what does that mean in terms of Jewish history?
But before we do that, I'd like to continue on the path through the argument that Ruth presents, and to demonstrate my ability to adapt by omitting several of the questions I planned to ask that you've already answered through your elucidation of the pre-modern outlook and conduct. We'll arrive instantaneously at modernity, which in your book is part 2, the first chapter in which you discuss the emancipation of the Jews and the way in which that altered their situation. And the title of, on that very page indicates or telegraphs to the reader where you're headed. Unanticipated consequences of emancipation. The emancipation is not something that you celebrate here, and it's something whose drawbacks you insist upon, even to the degree to which it involved the integration of Jews into democratic societies. You note that it brought new dangers, democratization. In fact, the new political situation in Europe proved more threatening to the Jews than the old. Jews failed to appreciate that the replacement of a single autocratic ruler by an elected assembly had potentially reduced rather than increased their political influence. Liberalization, democracy are not necessarily good for the Jews. And the last sentence of this section, you note, as with Christianity, the real nature of liberal democracy depended not on its professed intentions, but on how those ideals were put into practice. And as you show, they were not put into practice very effectively insofar as the Jews were concerned in the 19th century. The processes that were unleashed at the end of the 18th century held great dangers and destruction in store for them. Now, what's interesting to me in this book, in which you follow your discussion of the unintended and unfavorable consequences of emancipation with an account of the rise of the Zionist movement, is the absence of any reflection in this context on what liberalization and democracy have meant for Jews in other societies after the 19th century, in particular in America in the 20th century. I know that's something that you've discussed often in other places, but I was surprised that in this book you didn't consider the implications of this new situation for Jews in America today and the ramifications insofar as their exercise of power has to be considered.
Yeah, well, fair enough. I did not realize actually that I had slighted the benefits of emancipation. That was hardly my that was hardly my impulse. Of course, I mean, we are the beneficiaries of the whole idea of progress. But the failure of those ideas, I'm not the first to point them out. It's not just the failure as to what happened to the Jews. I need hardly say that Europe did not develop in an ideal way out of these ideas of emancipation. So the reconsideration of emancipation is not something that one takes on only because of the Jews, but because of Germany. I mean, for goodness sake, Germany was the ideal of culture and of development, and in the department which I have been a part of until now, Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, if you want to get a degree there, you still have to know German. That's how important German has been in the history of modern thought, let alone in other areas. So I'm surprised that and I'm sorry if that's the impression I gave of trying to slight the benefits of democracy and the benefits of the emancipation. No, my point is different. My point is that one of the things that democracy brought with it was anticipated, because what one thought of is citizenship, the rights of man, the rights of the individual, all those wonderful, splendid things. But if you look at this country now, I mean, you can see it now happening almost in America, whereas before you had to point to Europe. You see how democracy works. democracy works, you have to persuade people to make you their ruler or their leader. You have to persuade people, masses and masses of people. You have to convince them that if they elect you, if they appoint you, you will be able to do the job. Now, what happened in Europe is that a lot of people did not like liberalization. They did not like this process of what was happening as a result of the decline of religion, the decline of central authority, the decline of fiefdoms and so forth. And in order to gain election, that's how anti-Semitism, and by the way, I would really try to urge us all to think of anti-Semitism in terms of starting in the 1870s, not collapse everything into anti-Semitism, discrimination and Christianity and all, whatever. Anti-Semitism is a movement that begins in reaction to liberalization. That is what anti-Semitism is. It is an anti-liberal movement that does not declare itself as being an anti-liberal movement. It declares itself as being an anti-Semitic movement because it says the Jews are the ones who are benefiting from this. You think that this is freedom. You think that this is liberalization. But what it really is the Jews are now taking over our culture. They're taking over our law courts. They're taking over our universities. They're usurping our power. That is what anti-Semitism is. And it becomes so powerful because do I have to convince you that negative campaigning is more effective than positive campaigning? I mean, we live in a great democracy with a lot of wonderful ideas, and look the degree to which people use negative campaigning. It is absolutely astonishing. And why? Because it's effective. So consider, if I have to convince you of something, it's very elaborate. I'm going to tell you that if I bring science into the world, it's going to make your life better and all the rest of it. Very complicated ideas. Simple idea. The Jews. You want to know what's wrong with why you're unemployed? The Jews are taking your job. You want to know why you're poor? The Rothschilds have your money. You want to know why they don't go to church anymore? It's because the Jews are corrupting our culture. And the Jews, they become this catch-all for anti-liberal, anti-modern, anti-forces. I have written about the fact that, to me, anti-Semitism simply became the most powerful modern ideology because it's part of fascism, it's part of communism, and it's the only ideology that moved so effortlessly from Europe to the Middle East. I mean, there's absolutely no difference in the way in which the organization of politics against the Jews worked in Europe against the landless Jews and works against Israel, the landed Jews today. It's the same organization of politics, the same politics of finger-pointing, the same politics of organizing groups which are otherwise hostile to one another. But now you can get them under one real umbrella of this. So this is really... This is where the aberration goes to the other extreme. Because the Jews became politically so successful on one hand and so vulnerable on the other hand, it's kind of an astonishing combination that it is always profitable to destroy you and there's never any political cost to be paid for it. So if you are fashioned as a people in this way, that you always have visible property, that you always have visible power of some kind, and I can expropriate you, I can destroy you, I can annihilate you and take over your thing, and no one is going to punish me for it? I mean, you know, how can it be otherwise? I mean, how can it not happen almost? So you have to have a very sophisticated, you have to have a people which is almost like the Jews in its self-accountability in order not to have anti-Semitism as a possibility. And until now, I have been the most American of Americans because I felt that America is exceptional in this respect because it doesn't need anti-Semitism. In other words, in America, the Republicans blame the Democrats blame the Republicans, and they blame each other and they have to fight it out. But when the day comes when, you know, the Democrats and the Republicans can unite, and they would, if it would ever come to that point, the weakening of a real democratic structure, a real struggle over power, and instead of that, this looking for an easy excuse, an easy target. I mean, my feeling is not that this is what I'm afraid of happening here, but you have to be very careful about democracy because it has within it that possibility of corruption, really.
Well, maybe there is also as well, besides this explanation about the American condition, essentially, Jews, essentially the combination American-Jew is not a contradiction in the way it was in the nation states of Europe. The hyphenated existence is the American condition per se. Jews took themselves out of exile. America is not exile. The condition of Jews in America may be diaspora. The only thing they have of galut is Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galuyot. You know, it's not. This is not exile. And it has the Jews have taken themselves out of exile by two things. Either they migrated to a state that is not a nation state, where hyphenation is actually the very condition of the state, or that they have established a nation state of their own. Right? Exile, and I think Ruth is right, the Jewish condition of exile with emancipation was so unstable that actually that condition was destroyed, physically annihilated in the Holocaust. So you have the American condition is maybe not only because of the democratic nature of the American process, but the very nature of American self-definition that allows for that hyphenation that is the Jewish condition per se. That's my only sort of remark on that.
Let me just ask one more question. We're a little bit behind our arbitrary schedule. But as I noted a few minutes ago, this is very much a Zionist book, and the thrust of your presentation is in the direction of questions pertaining to the exercise of power, not on the part of citizens in a free diasporic country like the United States, but on the part of the Zionist movement and the State of Israel. It was interesting to me that your presentation of Zionism did not begin with the celebration of the resolve on the part of people like Pinsker and Herzl to break with the passive mentality of the past, to take control of the Jews' destiny and to liberate themselves from exile. You dwelt a little bit on that, but your focus at the beginning was more on the weaknesses of the initial Zionist visions, the ingredient that was missing from them. You present Herzl and Achad Ha'am, not one at the expense of the other, but both as figures who were lacking in this essential respect. Neither had an appreciation, among other things, of the vital importance of military strength. I'm not sure who you take to task more, but they're both lacking in ways that only subsequent, more military-minded Zionist thinkers aren't. And they do reflect a truer, more accurate understanding of the requirements of Jewish statehood and of Jewish survival in the Middle Eastern environment. The question I would ask in that connection is whether you would articulate a little more clearly, as I'm sure you will, the strengths of the figures who you celebrate at the end of the book, and consider the question of limitations on the exercise of Jewish power.
Well, I think I share with Moshe this a respect for, a gratitude for the miracle of self-emancipation of the Jewish people, or self-liberation of the Jewish people. I mean, Zionism was the most natural movement to emerge out of the 19th century because nation-states were, after all, springing up, and many have sprung up since. This was a phenomenon of the time. So it was a very natural occurrence for Jews to say, look at Poland, look at Ireland, look at this, look at that. Me too. I mean, this is our time. So in a sense, it was a very natural process, but a very difficult one, because after 2,000 years of adaptation to certain living conditions and not taking central political authority and not reclaiming your land and not becoming, settlers in a country and working out all the difficulties that entails, many people, just really were skeptical about the possibility. So those thinkers and those doers and those young people and those people who really fashioned this, I think brought about what I consider to be, forgive me, perhaps the greatest miracle of Jewish existence and of political life anywhere on the planet. And that is that in the same decade of the 1940s, when 1/3 of the Jewish people was destroyed in a destruction so terrifying that a new word had to be created. The word genocide was created for that horrific occasion. In that same decade, Jews reclaimed their sovereignty in the land of Israel, which had been under foreign occupation for almost 2,000 years. I mean, you really, this is a human miracle. Right? I mean, this is a human miracle. One doesn't have to invoke a higher thing. It is really an astonishing process. So yes, all those people who put their, who brought this about, each in his own way and each in her own way. I think the kibbutzim were of enormous importance, but so were the religious Jews who went, and so were the guys who wanted to open a store because they thought they might be able to do better in Tel Aviv than in somewhere else. Enormously, I can't say enough. I mean, really, that's why, if you think that I've slighted it, it makes me feel very sad. But my point was not that. My point was that they thought everybody else would be like them. And I end my book, really, with something from a political thinker, and I just changed one word in what he had written, right? Here is the quotation that I begin my conclusion with. Jews probably could have endured in the diaspora had theirs been the only type of political organization in the world. But their political system was not basically structured to defend itself against outside enemies seeking its annihilation. But I didn't write that paragraph. This paragraph was written by someone who wrote about democracy. And it was a book that was written about the collapse of democracy. He was sure that democracy was defeated. The French thinker Jean-François Revel, he wrote, democracy could have endured had it been the only type of political organization in the world, but its political system was not basically structured to defend itself against outside enemies seeking its annihilation. That is the problem I was trying to get at, and it's the problem that we face. You have a Jewish people that wants nothing more than to be able to live its wonderful way of life. Yes, fighting among themselves. You have Americans who feel that way. Who cares about what they're doing? Do I care really about the pathology of the Arab world and how they want to settle their problems? I don't. I mean, I wish them well. I hope that they prosper. I hope that they get along. I wish they were like us. I wish they would be richer than me. I wish they would be, happier than me. I mean, this is what one wishes for the world. What Jew have you ever met who has this idea in his mind? Gee, what I would really like is to conquer Egypt. I mean, it's or Damascus or whatever it is. It's not in our, I mean, it just makes no sense in the Jewish way of life, right? But what do you do? What do you do when you are in this situation, when you are not only, as he describes, democracies, surrounded by other people who do not have a democratic structure, but who structure their grandeur in terms of being able to conquer you? What do you do if you're America, which you see, I think, I don't want to get into local politics, but I am more terrified at this moment about America than I am about Israel in this regard. That I think in Israel, at last, I think people understand what situation they're in. I'm not talking about how it will be solved, but just to see the world as it is, who you are, what your political reality is, and who they are, and what their political reality is, how they want to wage their politics. So this is the problem. This is the problem. How, if you are this self-accountable, this self-reliant, this wonderfully happy, because on the happiness syndrome, Israel does almost better than any other country, right, as a happy people. So if you are this, but you are at the same time, you have been chosen through this crazy historical process, not your craziness, but the craziness of others who now need you. They need you. They have organized so much of their political life against you. It keeps them to, if you go, one of the things I tried to do here is to show all the functions that anti-Semitism serves. If you try to think of all the functions that anti-Semitism serves, you can really become very pessimistic, which I am not necessarily, but you can become very pessimistic. So that is the problem, and which I don't think has been faced even by the Jews before on this scale. What then do you do? What is your political response? How do you respond to an unprecedented situation and to what many people think is really an unsustainable situation? I think it's, so to me, that Israel and the Jewish people move this problem forward rather than backward is of world consequence. It is of ultimate importance, because you do not want the Arab world to end like Germany, and anti-Semitism is an illness. It's a pathology. It's ascribing the wrong answer to real problems, right? And it dare not be tolerated. Not for our sake only, but for their sake, because it is an insane idea that the Jews are responsible or that gaining the land of Israel is going to change anything in the Arab world. It's crazy. It's like just not real. So is it within our ability as thinking people, as acting people, as a nation together and as individuals, do we have that strength to both understand that, live with it, and try in our own way not to make the situation worse, not to invite, right, more of the same by certain kinds of obvious action, which has to invite more aggression.
I think it's time to open up for questioning from the audience, the group. And I guess the best way to do that is to ask people to raise their hands if they have questions. Please. Maybe it'd be better if you stand too.
Yeah, please.
My name is Yitzi Hammer. I'm here on the Tikvah summer program. I hope I can articulate my frustration into a question form. Just want to try and understand what your contention is exactly. As far as anti-Semitism being merely an anti-liberal movement and being directed at Jews because it's the easiest target, but not.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
So then, why? How is it possible that it's just directed at Jews as a way of default because there's nowhere else to target it and they're an easy target, and not more than that? There must be there must be anti-Semitic roots to anti-Semitism, and more than purely anti-liberal.
Of course. I mean, of course. I mean,
because it seems to belittle.
You mean the anti-Semitic Christian?
Anti-liberal.
I'm sorry. No, I did again. Thank you for that. I thank you for that very, very much. I certainly don't want to belittle the history of Christian anti-Jewish thought. I don't want to belittle the role that Judaism played in the history of Islam. I mean, you know, obviously there are many, many reasons why the Jews cumulatively become. But what I wanted to do is to present the problem as clearly as possible in political terms. And in political terms, to understand its function politically, I think that the thing that I'm adding to it, if I can see it that way, is that it is an anti-liberal movement. Not that that's only what it is. Of course not. It couldn't have that power on so many different levels, but it has absorbed into itself, and each new phase of anti-Jewish politics absorbs into itself the elements of the previous phases and then takes them in its own direction. So it becomes really a huge thing. Now, one of the hesitations of talking this way is that, you know, you can become overwhelmed. And I want to make it clear that I'm not overwhelmed. Okay, so I think that this is, you know, a huge, huge issue, but even though it has in itself, but look at now, Europe could have been freed of anti-Semitism, it seems to me. It had gone beyond it. But now how easily it has been re-imported into Europe and is now growing all over again because of the importation of Muslim anti-Semitism into Europe again. This is amazing, amazing, and extremely disturbing and distressing. So I did not mean to belittle.
One more point, sorry. At the beginning, you talked about how we have to seek power because we can't possibly say, well, we're powerlessness. That's something that's impossible to accept. That's assuming that there's possessing power versus having utter powerlessness and not having some kind of something in the middle. But would you say that being apathetic towards possessing power or the extreme of powerlessness would also be equally dangerous?
The extreme, well, I think that you know, look, I'm not only a parent, I'm a grandparent. You want me morally to bring children into the world without the power of protecting them? I'm just asking. I'm just asking the question. I don't think.
We're saying, oh, we don't want to conquer the Muslim world.
That's
we don't
right.
Want to wish better. We just want to survive without anybody bothering us.
That's right.
Which is sort of like saying that we went kitson letevach because we didn't get up and do anything about it. So you're saying. So what I'm asking if you're saying, because you didn't exactly say it, is that it would be too dangerous to say that. Because you can't just sit idle and say, well, I don't want to conquer you, I'll just stay over here.
Of course.
Then
okay,
they'll
but
inevitably come.
Well, I mean, what Israel is saying today is very firm, and as it's saying, we shall not be conquered. At least that. We shall not be conquered. You will not conquer us. But the fact is that you have to say this in terms which are very clear. And let me go beyond that. Since
we don't say that. We only say it
I know.
Months and months and months.
I know. My frustration.
By the way, we're here. We should really fight back.
It's my frustration exactly. I mean, I can push the argument further. But I would make a point, since you pressed me on this, I think that the Jewish people has erred because I think the error goes back to 1948. We have allowed ourselves to become the defendant. We are not the defendant, we are the plaintiffs. And I think that that has to do with an idea, if you will, of political engagement and power. So that by plaintiff, I mean, we were owed something in 1948. I mean, there was a decision taken at the United Nations. The United Nations has a charter. The Arab peoples did not live by that charter. They completely went against they should have been expelled from the United Nations. If you do not live by the Charter of the United Nations, you have no right to be a member of the United Nations. All the pressure from 1948 on is on the Arab League and on the Arab nations that did not recognize unconditionally, immediately. So this is right. Now, I don't say that if we had made this point from day one, it would now, the Arab world would now be accepting. I don't say that. But we have not even begun to make that demand. How dare? I mean, this is an outrage of outrages. And where are we? Not to say that this is our due. What? The children of Ishmael deserve everything, and the descendants of Isaac deserve nothing? I mean, what is this? Do we believe in justice? Do we believe in this? Do we not? So I think that there is a fault. If there is a fault, it's that we don't believe in justice. Because to believe in justice, you have to first believe in it for, this is the basic injustice that has been done. And we've allowed ourselves to be made as if we are the ones who committed the injustice. And we've allowed it, some people say it's the narrative. It's, well, what is a narrative? The narrative is your ability to do the, if I may just, maybe this isn't the best example. Examples are always so tricky when you take them because people focus on the metaphor or on the example and then they can take it in a wrong idea. But I do think of something like rape victims. You know, women here, you know, women have been raped, and it used to be very common that if you were raped, you know, you did not want to go public with it. You did not want to make a federal case out of it because it was better to hide the shame, or it was better. And what has this society done? I think rightly. It has said, look, that's a crime. And we want you, please, to have the dignity, to prosecute, because that person can be a rapist and they will rape again. So it's your duty on every account, to yourself and to the rest of the world. So if you take something like that as an example, I think that we have to, at this point, begin to say, I'm going back to 1948. And I don't answer to your charge. You can ask nothing of me until you first give me what belongs to me. Until there is that unconditional recognition of the state of Israel, don't even talk to me. I mean, if one could do something like that, this would be it.
I'm going to accord recognition to this young man.
Yes, I know this young man.
It's Avishai Dan. I'm also doing the Tikvah Summer Fellowship. And you mentioned justice before, and my question is directly related to that. I wanted to ask you, when it comes to the moral tradition, let's say, that has developed over the course of Judaism regarding force, and specifically the use of force, you painted a very stark picture of the challenges that Israel faces and the threats that Israel faces with its Arab neighbors. And when you're looking to see how Israel should conduct its wars, there are two possible ways of going about it. One is to say, well, we are a Jewish state, and we have a Jewish tradition, let's say, of ethics in wartime, whatever that means. Different sources you might use, many of which might have been written by individuals who are living in a state of powerlessness, and whether or not to bring those into our current methods of conducting war. And the other way is to say, look, we're a state now, so if we want to know how states conduct wars, we should look at other states. If we want to be a superpower in this region, we should look at the United States and other nations. So which realm, now that Jews have power again, do you think that Jews should draw on this tradition again to look and limit how it does wars? And or do you feel like now that we have power again, it's not realistic to go back in that way, and we should just do maybe not anything necessary to survive, but what must be done in that sense?
Well, it's a fair question, I think, but I would say militarily, on the military front, I would like Israel to do exactly as it does. I think that the balance that you describe has been struck, not always ideally. The code of ethics that was drawn up, I had my own reservations about the previous code of ethics. I don't know about the current one. If you study it carefully, yes, you can find. But I think that the Israeli military, you know, is, you know, for me, a model of probity. I mean, it's just an incomparable force. And of course, I would, from my point of view, I would wish it to err on, if it's going to err, I would wish it to err on the destruction of others before the danger to my own children. And I'll tell you why. I don't think it's strictly a moral calculation that I am making. Tell me if this is unfair. Gilad Shalit was traded for 1,000. Okay, so it's the Arabs who have decided that one Jew is worth 1,200 and whatever. It's Arabs. I didn't decide that. They decided it. They know that one Jew is worth 1,200. I would write that into my code of ethics.
Moshe. Yeah. Since we have...
I mean, till now we were in the realm of
yes,
vague ideas.
I should note for those who don't know that Moshe was involved in the
No,
writing.
I just want to say one thing about your assumption and then this statement. I don't think that conducting yourself as you should in war, and by should I mean constraining yourself morally speaking, is a problem for your survival and victory. If an army comes to you and said, we didn't win this war because you didn't allow us to shoot enough, the first thing you would say that there is a real connection between brutalization and non-professionalism. The Israeli army, if it fails in battle, it's not because they didn't allow it to massacre or whatever. Sometimes it lacks military IQ. Sometimes there are real problems. The problem is not, why the hell you're not letting us to kill all of them? And not only that, I would say the following. That if you want soldiers, and speaking particularly about Israeli soldiers, where their source of strength is in the sense that they're doing the right thing. If you want to weaken their resolve, let those forces who call for brutality operate, and then the backbone of the Israeli society will be broken completely. Because at the end, whatever advantage you have is first of all the sense that you're doing the right thing. Now, if you send a soldier to battle, and you tell him, in order to save one life, right, in order not to endanger one life, you can do this exchange rate. Let's say kill, now we're not talking intentionally kill 1,000, but kill collaterally 1,000, right? So we have lost in this battle now, I mean 40, 45, this is horrible, 48, as we talk. That means now we are entitled to kill 48,000 civilians collaterally. You know what that will mean for the military? You know how many Israelis are not going to show up to reserve? So I don't see morality as weakening either the capacity to fight or the will to fight. I have a completely different view of that. By the way, we are facing now a question which is strategic. It's not moral. Whether you want to take over Gaza and dismantle Hamas, or you want to stay with a weak opponent that you can deter and etc. This is a strategic. From a moral perspective, you can go either way. So I mean, this description that is, as far as I see it, it doesn't describe either the moral realities of the war or the strategic realities of the war. So you say, well, we are failing. First of all, we're not failing. let's say we don't accomplish because we restrain ourselves morally. Well, two things. First of all, if we fail, it's not because of moral restraints. It's for other issues. And some of them have to be solved. Look, we're not perfect as a fighting force. We are surprised by tunnels. This is not a moral failure.
Surprised by tunnels.
Okay, we knew about it. We didn't take care of that. Other issues, right? That's fine. We weren't surprised. You're right, but we didn't engage in ways of dealing with it ahead of time. What I'm saying that's my picture of how it goes, and it's a weakness. It's not a source of strength. It's a weakness to be permissive in such a way, and I would say, in my deepest of the beliefs, that will break the backbone of our society and its capacity to fight in a serious way. So I don't see it as a kind of a, I wouldn't describe it even the way this is described.
I have no argument with that, basically, but I would also say that the danger is on the other side. You have a demoralized society that if you think that it cannot protect you. So between these two extremes, obviously, demoralization is a possibility on both sides. And you've seen that possibility in Israel as well, that, you know, there are times when the population feels that it is not being sufficiently protected from what is happening, and then the cry comes. So yeah, I think, yes, anyway, please.
Aviatar.
I'm Aviatar, auditor in the advanced seminar. In the beginning, you were talking about, Professor Wisse, you were talking about us looking at our own and our own golal in some ways, like the fact that the temple and everything, and looking at ourselves as in a self-reflective type of way. Like, this happened to me because I didn't worship God properly, or because that there was sinat chinam, or all kinds of reasons. But it's still a self-reflective perspective on my power as a Jew, and there might be some similarities between that and the redemption that Professor Halbertal was mentioning before between Galut and Geulah. Like, it's still something that where I would like to see my status, my identity status as a Jew, maybe in somewhat similar to like the whole Haram genre. Want to ask the identity question of me as a Jew, but then afterwards when you came to contemporary Judaism, you started talking about survival. And it wasn't an identity survival, but it was rather a existential, not philosophical existential, but like an existence survival. Could I just continue being a Jew? Not where is my Jewish identity, is my Jewish identity brought to its maximum? When one talks about the status the Professor Halbertal was mentioning before between Galut and Geulah, then one might say, this is not me bringing my Jewish identity to the full. To the full would be not even living between that duality, or to the full would not needing to say the temple was, the Churban was because that I didn't worship God properly, but just, I do have Beit HaMikdash or whatever. You left that whole question of my Jewish identity status to, and you're willing to transfer it in contemporary Judaism. So the question is, could I exist, could I not exist in America, or in a modern state? Jewish state. So that I would like to.
Well, I mean, I don't know what makes you say that. I mean, I spend my life, teaching Jewish literature, which is Jewish culture, which is the repository of Jewish thinking and feeling through the ages. I mean, I don't know what you were exactly aiming at, but let me just suggest that what you may be pointing to is a real problem. That if the pressure on the Jewish people is really as I describe it, if the political situation that I have tried to describe of the Jews in the world, not solipsistically, you see, I think that moral solipsism is a danger for the Jewish people. Oh, the moral strut. I just love it when people engage in that. We are so moral, da-da-da. I mean, as if it's easy to be moral in this kind of a situation. It's very, very difficult to know where morality lies when you have the forces ranged against you that you have. You really have to think hard about moral, and you do, and that's why I say the military, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to intervene in that at all, because I think this is what people do, and individual soldiers do, and so forth. The problem is maybe what you're pointing to is that because the pressure on the Jews is so great, what happens to those Jews who have no Judaism? What happens to Jews for whom it means nothing? That has always been a problem in Jewish history. That's why I think, to me, 2 out of 10 is the Jewish dynamic. It's not the description of the tribes, it is the description of Jewish survival through the ages. And that's why in America, when people talk to me about assimilation, you'll forgive me. 2 out of 10, 2 out of 12, I'm sorry, 2 out of 12. That's what I think the Jewish survival rate has been sort of through history. We're not the Chinese. We didn't proliferate at a normal kind of rate. It's very hard. And it is extremely hard for people who don't love being a Jew in some way. So I take that for granted, and I find that to be really problematic among students whom I teach. They don't know anything about their Judaism. They come to a campus, and in the simplest way, they're assaulted with this anti-Israel propaganda. So for the Jews, Jewish students, for whom it means something, first of all, they know more usually, and they have a sense of their own moral security. They know who they are, and they can stand up for themselves. But somebody who doesn't know what it is to be a Jew, who doesn't really practice being a Jew, who doesn't like being a Jew, very problematic, and equally problematic for those people in Israel. You say I meet a lot of people, not a lot, but I meet people who have left Israel. And if I were, determining it, I would say, I'm so glad they did. I'm so glad they did, because negative Jews are a real problem for the Jewish people, have been through history. You know, what some say self-hating Jews, not self-hating. It's, they hate others. They hate Judaism or Jewish life and what it does and what it means and what it requires of them and all the rest of it. So your question of the content of what it is extremely important, if for no other reason than that one needs it in order to shore up what is necessary. I mean, I don't know whether that answers what you're asking, but it's extremely important.
Before I recognize another questioner, let me just stipulate that everyone who uses Hebrew words also translate them into English.
My name is Michael Hilberman. I'm attending the Advanced Institute on Judaism and Religion. I have a question about some of the American implications, some of the things that you said. For one thing, I'm curious, you piqued my interest when you said your deeper concern was with regard to America, and then you left me. So I want to hear about that. And I don't know where that's going. But also, in connection with America, there was something I was interested in what both of you said about America, some version of America being an exceptional experience for Jews. And I think you said, America doesn't need or hasn't needed anti-Semitism, which I find to be a fairly compelling idea. But then I wonder, well, why doesn't America need, or why hasn't America needed anti-Semitism? I recently attended a conference at Brandeis about Jews and blacks. And one of the emergent themes in that conference was, well, perhaps one of the reasons that America didn't need anti-Semitism is that America has had other internal targets. I'm not saying that I'm adhering to that view, but it certainly was the case for Jews in the American South, that their greatest virtue as Jews was that they weren't black. And in colonial America, which I studied, the best thing Jews had going for them was that they were not Catholic and that they were, in a sense, the enemies of the Catholic Church. So I wonder where, what your sense of why America hasn't needed anti-Semitism. I agree with it as an assessment, but I'm not sure exactly why that's been the case. I've been trying to sort that out myself.
Well, let me just say that is a huger question that I can adequately answer. although I can try. One of the things that I try to do is to make the distinction between discrimination, prejudice, bias of all kinds, and anti-Semitism. So, yes, it was terrible that Jews were discriminated against, and certainly the history of slavery is much worse than the history of discrimination against the Jews. And bias was terrible, and prejudice, and you couldn't get into Harvard, and you couldn't get into this, and so on. I don't weep for that. It's prejudice. It's terrible. It's discriminatory. It shouldn't exist. And America, in some sense, has gotten beyond that. That is different from the organization of politics against the Jews. And the closest to it, you see, is what Mr. Perkins wrote in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, which generated a considerable heat, at least in circles that I inhabit, where he wrote that Obama's and the administration's idea of the 1%, the 1%, the 1% reminds him of anti-Semitism. I concur. I concur with that, you see. That's what I mean by, that is a demagogic kind of idea, that what you say is, instead of saying, look, this country has tremendous problems which have to be solved in this and this in particular way, what you try to do is you try to create a politics of finger-pointing, a politics of blame, which is simplistic and which is satisfying because it says, look, that's the problem. And then everybody thinks, oh, sure, that's the problem, that's the problem. You see, and that is the danger that I see emerging as a possibility. If it ever takes that form, for the time being, I think America still stays pretty healthily, resists that kind of finger-pointing. I don't think it's gone in that direction. So yes, negative campaigning works in here, but you see in the polity at large, you still have the idea that collectively one is going to have to solve one's problems, and they are complex. They're not solved at the expense of any such simple solution that is one group of people. So that goes a part of the way to answer what you're saying. That's what I, and you see that in Israel, I mean, the question doesn't even come up of that kind of, there was a tremendous amount of antagonism, you know, Haredim or this. I mean, you know, everybody has their, I don't have to tell you about the intensity of, but that's not necessarily a terrible thing. If I can just make one other point that may sharpen it, may not. I hope it just sharpens it. You see, I sometimes make the distinction. Why I don't like the description of groundless hatred, when the Talmud blames kind of the destruction or tries to say that one of the reasons for the destruction of the temple is groundless hatred, it means the groundless hatred of one group of Jews for another. And Jews really think that this is always used now in contemporary debate. Oh, don't get into this because this is groundless hatred of one group for another. You see, all you have to do is look at America. There was a civil war in this country. A civil war that took so many lives. Was it the most devastating war in American history in terms of American lives? Yes, it was. Because of one group fighting another. Guess what? Everybody thinks that, in a sense, a stronger America emerged. Why? Because Rome was not at the gates. So I say it over and over again in this room. I've said it before. It was Rome. Right? That's what one has to know. That you cannot sustain internal conflict of a certain order when there are enemies of that of enormity at the gate. That's when it becomes, and that's why it becomes so horrible. But democracy will always require healthy, combative exchanges of ideas and differences of opinion, right?
I'm Lily. I'm a 2-week seminar fellow. My question goes back to Professor Halbertal's comment about the power of the code of ethics, especially sort of in terms of how it would affect the morale of soldiers and the country as a whole. And I'm curious, having a code of ethics for your military in Israel something that is therefore giving Jews the power of having the code of ethics, or is it a Jewish power? Is the ethics itself a Jewish power?
Can you refine or explain the question?
Is the adoption of
Right.
the code of ethics Jewish?
Jewish per se.
Per se,
Right.
or not? Could you say what you said about how the code of ethics affects soldiers and the military in general at any country and their army?
I think that in democratic societies, I don't think it's particularly Jewish in that respect. By the way, if you look at other forces engaging in war, where the ethical fabric is broken, at the way it impacts soldiers and their capacity to fight. And I'm talking about open societies and democratic societies, that their technique of fighting is not about wasting wave after wave of manpower like the Soviets or others. You will see the corrosive effect on the soldiers. I would say if you get into the mindset of a soldier, one danger always in a life of soldiering is feeling that you were morally betrayed, right? Because you are called upon to sacrifice, make the ultimate sacrifice. But you meet with a reality that is very cynical. That's the soldier condition, per se. Right? And what happened to soldiers when they meet that is that their horizons shrink, both as a fighting force and a moral force, into protecting their own peer. And that's it. And the hell with the rest of it. You should read a book by an American psychiatrist called Achilles in Vietnam, describing for a variety of reasons the corrosive power of what we would call the moral betrayal of a soldier. So then I wouldn't say it's uniquely Jewish. I think for democratic open societies that their fighting force depends on the particular motivation of soldiers and their identity with the cause. That kind of behavior has a very, very hard impact, right? In terms of the way they fight, their capacity to engage, their trust, the loss of trust as an issue. These are deep issues to soldiering when it's transparent and dependent upon the active participation of soldiers in the purpose and meaning of the war. So it's not, I think, particularly Israeli. I think, still, I think, you know, there are, I don't like to say it, but it's true. I don't like to say it by way of explaining ourselves to the world. It is true that the Israeli army is exceptional in the way it engages in war, right? It's true. I think vis-a-vis care of civilian casualties and care of collateral killing, it is exceptional. But the horrible impact of brutalization on life of soldiers is not particularly Jewish. By the way, unfortunately, I'm saying something sad. Those who draw from the language of the weak are the most brutal in our society. and the way Jewish themes, kind of traditional Jewish themes, are fed into this discussion, I'm not happy with it. It's not like, well, all this morality grew up in conditions of weakness and all that, and all that, all that. Actually, conditions of weakness breed that type of fantasy of total destruction of the other, etc. And when they are applied to a condition of strength, this is lethal. The worst thing for a country is to talk the language of the weak from a position of strength. So the conversation in here is slightly more complex on that level.
My name is Nelson Schwartz. I'm in the Summer Institute. I have a question. I'm trying to figure out how to articulate this, which is we're in a new situation in terms of exercising power, as all of you said. Do you think we, however, find the response to that power, which is going to happen in the world, do we see that through the lens of our long experience in Galus when we were powerless, like in the shtetl or the ghetto or the Holocaust, when in fact, as a country, as Israel, as Jews, if we exercise power, other countries are going to oppose us, just as America was attacked at Pearl Harbor, or Britain was attacked in the Falklands War, but a long way away. But do you think we automatically see that our enemies, particularly their opposition, as anti-Semitism, rather than the battles that all countries have in terms of land and power? That's my first question. Second is, do you think we're too caught up in the galut mentality of worrying, like Ben Gurion said, it's not what the Goyim think, it's what the Jews do. And do you think there's a sense that we're too caught up in this traditional Jewish galut mentality? It seems like Israel is the only country, or Jews the only people on Facebook putting up stuff about international law, this UN resolution, and that article, this thing. I only see Jews doing that. I never see America or George Bush or Britain appealing to all these abstract notions. We exercise power, and we do it because we're a country. I'm wondering if some of that galut mentality still kind of corrupts our thinking today, and we shouldn't be as, worried about that.
I don't know whether, I wouldn't ascribe it to galut mentality. I would ascribe it to a reality of a barrage, of an assault, which is not directed at any other country. There was no other country about which a resolution was passed at the United Nations saying that Zionism is racism, which was spread to parts of the world that had never seen a Jew before. I come back to the fact that you have to understand, we have to understand, we don't want to understand, we don't want to think about it, the enormity of investment of anti-Jewish rhetoric, of painting Israel in a certain light on all fronts. Obviously this begins with the Arab world and its needs. It needs this. It needs to direct attention elsewhere. It needs to organize all its diverse groups. It has all these, it does it effectively. And then you have the role of the left, which plays a particular role here. Suddenly, anti-Jewish, anti-Israel becomes the organizing principle of radical leftism all over the world. So this creates a different kind of mentality.
I see a difference in that there's a difference in the Arab opposition to Israel, which is a political, powerful state with an army, as being qualitative and quantitatively different to opposition to Jews in Europe, whether before the Holocaust or today or America, that we tend to conflate those, or not?
No, I would say, of course, it's different in kind, and but if it's different in degree, the degree has only escalated. So if it's different in degree, but the function that it plays in Arab societies is the same function that it played in European societies, the political function that this plays. And I think it puts enormous pressure on the Jew. You recommended a book. One of the books which one can only sort of half recommend, read with caution, but read, is still Jean-Paul Sartre's book that he wrote in World War II. Here he was, a Frenchman on the left, very much on the left, and And in the middle of the war, he suddenly realizes, what is this antagonism against the Jews? What is anti-Semitism? And he writes very persuasively from a psychoanalytic, but without defining his terms. He defines the pathology of the anti-Semite, that this is a pathological condition. And then he writes about what the Democrat does in this situation and then what the Jew should do in this situation. And he realizes, at least, that the situation that he's describing is not made by the Jew, and there's nothing, in a sense, existentially, which is his thing. What attracts him to this is the existential situation of the Jew, right, who is confronted with this thing. So that one of the reasons I come back to this, the defendant, we have been made the defendant. And so what you're talking about is, if you're the defendant, you want to put up a defense. You want to say, international law allows me to do this, I don't go beyond, and this, what you're so tentative about saying, and I understand this, you don't want to go bragging and saying, look, our army does this and so forth. But still, these are statements that are made in defense of what Israel is. See, tactically, it's something I would never do. One of the things I try to tell student groups that come to me, never defend. Never defend. Defensively, if you have to go into defensive warfare, fine. But nobody wants to go into defensive warfare. It's a horrible kind of warfare, you're pushed back. Attack. It's they who are wrong. It's they have to change. They are accountable. You have to turn the argument around. Yes, Israel is the worst country in the world. I'm not interested in talking about Israel. I want to talk about you. And if you're interviewed on the radio or something, and somebody says, what about Israel? You say, yes, yeah, blah. What about this? What about this? Never get on the defensive. If one could begin to develop a healthy idea, and why is one doing it? Not for wrong reasons. I'm convinced that one is doing it for their sake, because they really have to improve. They really have to change. We don't really have to change that much. We could be better always, but they really need to change a lot. So it's time to start putting the pressure where it belongs.
I want to say something about it. Maybe I'll take a different angle at that. Israel's well-being is dependent, unfortunately, but it's true, on the moral support of the West to its cause, especially in the United States and less in Europe, but it's a fact. And weakening that moral support is extremely harmful existentially for the future of our country. It's a fact.
I don't believe that, actually, so it's not a fact. Okay. It's a contention.
Whatever I say, I think that it is, right? I think it's a fact. I would say the following. The great support that Israel has from its friends and allies is not only based on political, realpolitik, calculated of interests, because Israel can deliver not much on that reality vis-a-vis the Arab world, but it depends upon a kind of a moral sympathy with the cause of Israel. I think it's true about the United States public support for Israel as sharing in kind of democratic Western values and other things, and it's true about Europe to a certain degree. And this is why this issue of answering, dealing with that, et cetera, it's not only we are afraid of what people are thinking about. By the way, all these issues of morality at war, as far as I go, very little to do with what the Goyim will say. But there is an issue here that we cannot avoid, which is that the erosion of the moral support and identity with Israel is an existential problem for the future of Israel, especially in the United States. Now, I just want to say, the way to go about it is not by saying, so what do you say about China? And why don't you talk about Libya? And how is it, which is true, that all these tzaddikim, you know, these pious guys in the United States, you know, Human Rights Council, etc., etc. I think the best is to present the picture. What is our dilemmas? How we go about it? In what way we sometimes fail? And what do we do? And present it in an honest way, and we have a powerful case. I also don't think that all of the observers around are anti-Semites that are waiting to eat us alive. There is a whole public there that really is ignorant, is not anti-Semitic, nothing. It's just being fed by different directions and gets slowly a picture of whom we are and what we do, and that has to be confronted. And I think the worst thing for us is to come from the prescription, all of them are really against us, you know, and etc. I think there is a world out there. I mean, you would never change the hardcore anti-Semitic, anti-Israel public. But there is a public out there that looks at you. And you have to address him. And I think the best way to address him is just be transparent in a serious way of what are your dilemmas and what you go about them, and then ask them, and how do you go about them? That's, I think, the best way. You know, I was engaged in those issues, you know, with Goldstone, and I said, the first thing I will do is, you know, let's lay the issues the way, and then each reader will think maybe about his own country, how they deal with it. I think it's wrong for us to think that all of them anyhow hate us. I think it's wrong for us that when we do that, it's because we care so much of being liked. But we have an issue that is, as I think, existentially is a problem for us because of our well-being, and we all care about the well-being of the Jewish people in Israel. Our well-being still is dependent upon a moral identity and identification with the case of Israel in the West, especially in the United States, but in the West as a whole. And that's the issue. Then you have to ask yourself, by the way, and I'm not a self-hating Israeli or Jew, what things you are doing wrong that can change that as well. I mean, there's some things that we were pushed politically to defend positions that I think are not explainable in principle, that are a problem. So so that's what we should do about it. The best way is really to present the way we go about these things honestly, and make your case in a powerful way. And I'm saying, I mean, I'm anxious about that. I'm not anxious about the behavior of our military. I'm anxious about the issue of the erosion of the moral support for Israel.
I think Ruth has some counterfactual remarks to make.
Counterfactual. And firstly, I think you can prove that it's exactly the opposite, that the better Israel becomes, the better, morally better on every phase. The more it succeeds, the better it is to its citizens, the more equal and all the rest of it, the more it will be attacked by precisely the forces you're talking about. So you cannot give any factual evidence of that. It's exactly the opposite. It's because of the moral success of the Jews, and it's because of all the success that goes with it, that Jews do attract this antagonism against them. So the whole equation is I would say, excuse me. Well, I'm flattening it a little bit, but
No, not flattening. You are ascribing to me a position that I don't hold.
Okay, but
the Jews have to be moral so they get support.
No.
I didn't say that.
I understand, but but you are saying that there's a correlation between how moral is the perception of Israel.
I didn't say that.
You said a perception of Israel as a moral entity is fundamental to the support that it will get from the United States and from the Western countries and all the rest of it. I mean, I think that's what you said. Am I wrong?
Yes, that's what I said.
Okay. So I would say that it is unfortunately not the correlation. The Jews of Eastern Europe and the Jews of Eastern Europe were, to my mind, the highest pinnacle of morality in some sense. Yes, of course, they had their thieves and they had their things. But wait a minute, Israel is, everybody can recognize, everybody who has eyes, who does a comparative study, who examines the facts that you will put before them, before the fact, during the fact, after the fact, will know what you're saying. That isn't what creates it, unfortunately. Then let me ask another issue. I mean, what is morality? And here, really, this is I think Israel has really committed only one bad thing against the Arabs. Only one. Now, I hesitate to say it, because if I say it, then it can become, aha, this is what Israel did to the Arabs. But my emphasis is on the only wrong, and I will stick, that Israel ever did to the Arabs, and particularly to the Palestinian Arabs, is to impose Yasser Arafat as the leader over them. It is something that no Jew would ever have done to his fellow Jews. Never would they have taken a Yasser Arafat, the leading terrorist in the world, and said, you can be the leader of the Palestinians. Never. But why? Because in the most cockamamie extent, they decided that arming your enemy was going to increase your security. I teach Helm stories, and in the history of Helm stories, there has never been a polity that armed its enemy with the expectation of gaining security. It is absolutely, it was a preposterous thing. But to say that is to say it from the point of view of Jewish political failure. Yeah. Oh yes, you took the chances, and one had to take the risk. Believe me, but one knew in advance that if one put a fox in charge of not only the hen house, but a fox in charge of your security, right? And this is what you did. And you imposed this on the Arab because he said that he was their leader and so on. He was a disgraced terrorist in Tunisia, right? He was the Al-Qaeda, he was the leading terrorist of his time. And one took it and one imposed it on the Arab people because one said, this is going to make our life easier. And Rabin even said, because he can afford to kill and I cannot. This is not morality, my friend. It's not morality. It's certainly not great politics. So I'm only saying
now
this.
Now you're attributing to me.
No, I'm not saying, no, I'm not attributing this to you. My only point is, point is that morality, to distinguish what is moral and what is not moral in this very complicated thing, it will never be determined by my saying that it's moral or by your saying that it's moral. We have to make up our minds which was the more moral thing, and it has to do, to some extent, with the consequences of those actions.
Are you tired? I'm trying to recognize people in the order in which I spotted them.
You'll get more as the time goes on.
I'm Nama Cohen. I'm a Tikvah Summer Fellowship participant. I wanted to ask you about two things. First of all, you were talking about the things that are morality questions versus the things that are strategical questions. And I wanted to ask you, because many people are talking now in Israel about how Hamas is using our morality for his strategical decisions. And I think that if we look at this past operation, we can say that by doing so, Hamas is making us hurt more people. And maybe if we would choose a different morality strategy, then we can make them hurt less Palestinians. So this is the first thing I wanted you to elaborate with. And the second, what you were just talking about, moral sympathy of other countries, and you also started talking about it, that I think that we can claim that the reason that the world is talking to us more than they talk about Syria or Libya or whatever happens in other countries is because they do have a moral sympathy to us. And because they have the sympathy, it makes them think that they can relate to us and understand, and they would act in a different way. So maybe to create this moral sympathy would be doctrine. And someone can translate this.
Will be against us, will work against us.
Yeah.
Well, if I'll just briefly.
Go ahead.
It's Saul Bellow, in his book Jerusalem, To Jerusalem and Back. He has a marvelous section where he talks about how Israel becomes the moral playground. I think, to some extent, this plays into this. You know, the moral playground. Is it out of sympathy, whatever, but this is almost as bad as the kind of organization of politics against you. If you think, you know, this is where I delight in talking about morality. That's my moral playground, you know, and that's where I debate all the time in such heat. Is it doing the right thing? Is it doing the wrong thing? You can always touch off these things. That's one of the dangers of this thing. But the first question, please.
Okay. I just want to say something about the concern, and it relates to a way in which you might have misrepresented not intentionally, but collaterally, my
never intentionally, for sure.
No, chas v'shalom. Look, the issue of military ethics or the ethics of a country is not a problem of hasbara. It's not a problem of how you explain yourself to the world. That's not the issue. You are a soldier and you send your child, your son, your daughter to that engagement. You want them to win, to protect their country, to do their mission. You want them to come safe back home as much as is possible. And you want them, not because of hasbara, to be capable of looking themselves at the mirror and say, I've done the right things. It's not what the others will say. It's very little to do with that. And whether it brings sympathy or not, it doesn't matter. You send kids to those kasbah, and they ask you, what do I ought to do? You send pilots who get coordinates. They want to know, not because what the others will say or Saul Bellow or whoever. They want to know that those who picked the target and gave them the coordinates was careful in choosing a target that it's, in choosing, for example, the sort of ammunition that try to minimize killing of innocent civilians, etc., etc. It's not, all these issues are not matters of international relations. It has to do with the integrity and sense of action and people whom you send into action, including your own and your own children. That's one thing. And I don't think that for us to succeed in the world, in that respect, I don't think so, is to be more and more moral, because that will bring us success. That's not my position. I'm saying something else. I look at our reality in the world. There is an attempt, an ongoing attempt to portray us as South Africa, as an apartheid state that intentionally kills children all over the place, a brutal force. It's not done, it's a political strategy that unfortunately might be effective if we don't counter it in a serious way. For that I am concerned. And I'm not talking about countering it in the margins of lunatic anti-Semitic. I'm talking about good-willing observers standing on the side, not knowing the hell what's going on. And I'm concerned about this, honestly. And I think there are two bad things doing in that respect. One is declare I am the best in the world, just declare it. And you, look at you. And second, they anyhow all hate us. I think it's a wrong approach, those two things. You have to assume that there is a world out there, and you can make a serious case to them. And don't send someone who sounds like the Minister of Heavy Industry in Slovakia, or whatever. You know, this is a serious existential matter. This is the way I go about it. Now, you have suggested something that people suggest. If in the first occasion we have just bombed the hell out of them, right? Oh. Okay, you don't. So you don't. So I'm not sure what you were suggesting, and it's fine. So I'm just saying two things. We all talking about ourselves. In my, unfortunately, this is something very sad for my generation. Now we're talking about our children. It's that my daughters and son-in-law's generation who's in Gaza, right? I have their family. And the issue of morality for them is you know, he described entering a house, you know, and I just asked him, how did you leave the house, right? You don't want them to break furniture, etc., etc. It's really not about public relations. It's about his own well-being as a human being. I would say even as a Jew, as an Israeli. And this is why I don't think, then there is the other issue that I'm very concerned about, because I see how it's working around, how the delegitimization of Israel as a country, as a powerful eroding impact on its existential well-being, politically speaking. And this is a problem we have to address. You cannot say, you know, they all hate us or whatever, or, you know, I wouldn't say even go into attack. We have to seriously present for the good-willing people, and there are plenty around us, what's going on. What is our considerations, how we go about things, etc., etc.
If I just reframe.
By the way, I just want to say something paradoxically about the world. Our enemy, we have enemies in the Arab world. Our big supporter now in the war, you know who is this?
Egypt.
Egypt. Now, by the way, Egypt is such a big supporter of us that it wants us to go farther than some of us want to go. Right? If you look geopolitically, there are alliances. I think, by the way, in terms of my hero in these issues using power is Ben Gurion, by the way. He wasn't Echad Ha'am or Herzl. He was the first one to think that the declaration of the State of Israel will bring about a ground attack by all Arab states around. But I don't think it's good for Israel to portray its conflict as the Jewish conflict with the Islamic world as a whole. I don't think it's the good policy for us. We're not fighting the Islamic world as a whole. We're not fighting world anti-Semitism. We're fighting states around. We have alliances. We do different things. By now, Sisi is I'm sure he's not a big tzaddik and a Jew lover. He's a strong ally of us, right? So this is the way I think you go about the world.
It's we should, but since you wrote the book, I want to give you the last word.
Well, you know, I won't answer to the straw man of the whole world hates us and so forth. Of course, that's not the point. And of course, you know, Hasbara has improved and one does one's best. If those were the issues, then I don't think I would have written my book. I mean, I spend a lot of time writing op-eds and doing this, and I don't think you could have gotten a better person than Michael Oren, who is here, or than Dermer, who's here.
Sure.
And they don't talk with a strange accent. They're extremely effective.
Absolutely.
But we all know what goes on. And it's not that the whole world is against us. To the contrary, I would say, though, that the Jews have been turned into the fist of the democratic world. And no Jew in Israel or elsewhere wanted to be the fist of the democratic world. So I don't know whether this is a role you ever sought for yourself. I doubt it. It's certainly a role I never sought for myself.
I
and
just
I
want
don't
to be
know,
the fist of the Jewish people.
well, the fist, yes, but even yes, but the fact is that one is. I'm sorry to say that the role that Israel has been cast in is as the fist of the resistance, the line that is going to be held or not held against a large part of the most enraged, most politically really pathological part of the world today. It's just simply the reality. You just have to look at the United Nations, how it's configured. The United Nations is not the most important organization. If you like Ben Gurion, you'll know Shmum. I agree in a sense that you can, you know, write it off in some sense, but it is there. It is a strange situation, and I was just pleading. Jews have not, we have succeeded at everything in the world as far as I'm concerned. Succeeded in economics, succeeded in admirable ways, succeeded in morality, succeeded in many ways. We are not the most successful polity in the history of nations, to put it mildly. There is something about our political situation which is aberrant and at this point really frightening in some way. I just want people to start thinking in terms of how Jews exist politically in the world in relation to other people, not solipsistically in relation to themselves in their own, but in relation to the real world out there, how they figure into it. And if anyone can find better ways, improved ways of dealing with this, this is one of the things that I think Tikvah hopes and prays is possible, that good minds can at least make sure that the situation does not deteriorate. And
Well, you know, I spent a lot of time in the last couple of weeks attending different sorts of gatherings and found myself asking myself, where is all the intelligence and passion that you used to find in Jewish communal gatherings when issues of this magnitude were discussed? Now I know the answer. It's all here. Thank you both very much.